Welcome to a journey into one of history's darkest chapters with the World War Archive, a story that remained buried for decades, hidden by both shame and political necessity. I'm your host, Jim Beaver, and today we're examining Unit 731, a name that should be etched in our collective memory alongside other symbols of wartime atrocity. In 1984, a student from Keio University in Tokyo was browsing through a second-hand bookshop when he stumbled upon a box of documents that would forever change our understanding of World War II's Pacific theater. These weren't just any documents, they were incriminating evidence of systematic human experimentation on a scale that rivals the most notorious Nazi medical programs. But here's what makes this discovery even more chilling. By the time these documents surfaced, the man responsible for these atrocities had already lived 15 peaceful years after the war, dying comfortably in his bed in 1959. His name was Dr. Shiro Ishii, and his legacy represents one of the most profound failures of post-war justice. If you're fascinated by dark corners of history, secret cover-ups, and the real stories behind conspiracy headlines, there's so much more for you to discover with Scoob, the AI-powered podcast app with access to over 1,500 expertly curated podcasts. Whether you crave deep dives into war crimes, psychological warfare, or the hidden cost of advancing science at any cost, you'll find fast, focused insights only on Scoob. Download Scoob from the App Store or Play Store. Let's get started, because the most disturbing truths are often the ones that history tries hardest to forget. To understand Unit 731, we must first understand its creator. Dr. Shiro Ishii wasn't some rogue scientist operating in the shadows. He was a distinguished graduate of Kyoto Imperial University, a trained microbiologist who began his career as a surgeon in the Imperial Japanese Army in 1921. Ishii was fascinated by the potential of biological and chemical warfare that he had observed during World War I. But unlike others who saw these weapons as tools of last resort, Ishii saw them as the future of military dominance. His vision was both brilliant and terrifying. Japan could gain an insurmountable advantage through biological weapons grounded in human experimentation data. The Japanese army didn't just tolerate Ishii's vision, they embraced it. By 1930, he had begun his research at the Tokyo Army Medical School, and his program would eventually employ more than 5,000 individuals across 26 centers throughout occupied China. This wasn't a small, secretive operation. This was an industrial-scale program of human experimentation. Ishii's ascension through military ranks was meteoric, and by 1945, he had reached the position of Surgeon General. But his true legacy wasn't built in operating theaters saving lives. It was constructed in the laboratories and testing grounds where he systematically destroyed them. Segment 3. The Compound of Horrors. In 1936, Ishii's operation moved from Tokyo to a location that would become synonymous with unimaginable cruelty. Pingfan, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, later renamed Unit 731 in 1941. The choice of location was strategic. It provided what Ishii saw as an endless supply of Chinese and Russian subjects for his experiments. Picture this: 20 kilometers southwest of Harbin, on 32 square kilometers of stark, empty land, rose a complex that defied imagination. 150 buildings spread across more than 2 square miles, functioning as a sinister combination of prison, laboratory, living quarters, and military barracks. This wasn't just a research facility, it was a city dedicated to human suffering. The scale was staggering. The compound could house up to 400 prisoners at any given time, but this number represented only a fraction of those who would pass through its gates. Each year, in this single facility alone, approximately 600 prisoners lost their lives to inhumane experiments. When we consider that this was just one of 26 known laboratories in China, the total scope of the program becomes almost incomprehensible. A former worker who testified after the war described walking through buildings filled with large glass jars containing dismembered human remains, preserved in formaldehyde, organized by nationality: Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, English, French, and American. This wasn't science, it was systematic dehumanization on an industrial scale. One of the most chilling aspects of Unit 731 was how its operators psychologically distanced themselves from their crimes. The prisoners weren't referred to as people, or even as subjects. They were called maruta, meaning logs in Japanese. This wasn't accidental terminology, it was a deliberate strategy to strip away the humanity of their victims. When scientists required additional individuals for experiments, they simply submitted a request form. The Kwantung Army would promptly fulfill these requests, delivering human beings like laboratory supplies. These people were transported by trains and vehicles through concealed underground tunnels, their heads covered with sacks to maintain secrecy. The bureaucratic nature of this process is perhaps what makes it most horrifying. There was no passion, no anger, just cold, administrative efficiency in the procurement and disposal of human lives. Once experiments left the maruta exhausted and no longer useful, they were considered worthless and executed without ceremony. The Khabarovsk trial provided us with specific testimony about this process. Mitomo Kazuo described how in September 1944, 2 Russian individuals who had been exhausted by extensive experiments were simply shot and buried at a cattle cemetery under Lieutenant Nakajima's orders. This wasn't an aberration, it was standard operating procedure. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 represented a systematic exploration of human suffering. Unlike the random acts of violence that characterize much wartime brutality, these were methodical, documented procedures designed to push the boundaries of human endurance and map the limits of biological warfare. Prisoners were subjected to freezing temperatures to induce frostbite, with researchers meticulously documenting tissue necrosis. Others were deprived of water to the point of death or used as living practice subjects for surgical procedures. Bullets were deliberately embedded in bodies so surgeons could practice extraction techniques. The surgical experiments reached levels of sadism that defy comprehension. Amputations were performed without anesthesia, and researchers sometimes reattached body parts in unprecedented arrangements, attaching limbs in different configurations or, in one documented case, removing a stomach entirely and connecting the esophagus directly to the intestines. High-pressure chambers and spinning centrifuges tested the limits of human survival under extreme conditions. Prisoners were exposed to flamethrowers, phosphorus, and chlorine gas to study the effects of burns and chemical injuries. Some experiments ventured into realms of pure sadism, injecting seawater as an alternative to saline, transplanting animal blood into humans, or burying individuals alive to study suffocation. But perhaps the most notorious procedures were the vivisections, surgical dissections performed on living, conscious subjects. These operations were so overwhelmingly gruesome that testimonies from the unit's own doctors and medical assistants at post-war trials bordered on the unimaginable. While the individual experiments were horrific, Unit 731's true purpose was far more ambitious: the development of biological weapons capable of mass destruction. The facility wasn't just torturing individuals, it was developing the capacity to inflict suffering on entire populations. The 1st Division of Unit 731 was specifically tasked with propagating infectious germs, focusing on deadly pathogens including plague, cholera, gas gangrene, anthrax, typhoid, and paratyphoid fever. The scale of production was staggering. At full operational capacity, the unit could produce 300 kilograms of plague bacteria and up to 900 kilograms of typhoid germs per month. The 2nd Division was responsible for testing these weapons using aircraft bombers at proving grounds under realistic battle conditions. Their goal was nothing less than the large-scale extermination of human targets through biological warfare. The Anta testing grounds, located 146 kilometers north of Harbin, became the site where these weapons were tested on human subjects. The facility was so important that Ishii regularly commuted there by light aircraft, accompanied by his aide, to personally oversee the testing. The breeding of disease vectors became a crucial component of the program. Unit 731 maintained thousands of rats and mice for breeding plague-infested fleas, which were considered strategically crucial for biological warfare. At the Hilar branch alone, about 13,000 rats were maintained during the summer of 1945, highlighting the industrial scale of preparation for biological warfare. The testing phase of Unit 731's biological weapons program revealed the true scope of their ambitions. At the ANTA testing grounds, researchers conducted experiments using bacteria shells containing deadly pathogens such as plague, anthrax, and gas gangrene detonated in close proximity to human subjects cruelly tied to stakes. Kawashima's testimony at the Khabarovsk trial provides us with horrifying details of these tests. In the summer of 1941, approximately 15 human subjects were brought from the detachment's inner prison specifically for experiments involving the Ishii porcelain bomb packed with plague-infested fleas. The testing process was methodical and militarily sophisticated. Guidance for pilots came through flags and smoke signals marking the proving ground. Aircraft would drop approximately 24 bombs from heights between 100 and 200 meters, releasing plague fleas across the target area. After sufficient time for potential infections to develop, the subjects were disinfected and flown back to the inner prison where they were monitored to determine infection rates. Kurosawa witnessed similar tests in late 1943, where 10 individuals were secured to stakes 5 meters apart. A fragmentation bomb packed with anthrax bacteria was detonated 50 meters away, allowing researchers to study both the immediate trauma from bomb fragments and the subsequent progression of anthrax infection. In January 1945, another experiment involved 10 Chinese prisoners of war tied at intervals of 10 to 20 meters and exposed to a bomb explosion contaminated with gas gangrene germs. All 10 prisoners succumbed within a week, suffering excruciating pain from injuries laced with infectious agents. Unit 731's weapons development program extended far beyond conventional bombs. They designed and constructed unique delivery systems for biological agents, including sprayers disguised as fountain pens and walking sticks for covert operations, and specialized porcelain aerial bombs for subversive missions. One of the most insidious weapons was deployed on October 29, 1940, when the Japanese Imperial Army released plague-infected fleas over a village near Ningpo in Zhejiang Province. Initially misperceived by villagers as a routine reconnaissance mission, the true nature became evident as residents rapidly fell ill with plague. Japanese soldiers arrived wearing airtight suits and masks, rounding up infected men and transporting them to Unit 731. This incident demonstrates how biological weapons could be used not just for immediate destruction, but for ongoing experimentation on disease progression in affected populations. Perhaps even more diabolical was Ishii's development of food-based biological weapons. Exploiting the dire starvation conditions in occupied China, he had local delicacies such as sweet cakes infused with typhoid and paratyphoid bacteria. Japanese soldiers secretly distributed 300 to 400 of these contaminated cakes around Nanking, placing them near fences and trees to create the illusion they were accidentally abandoned. Desperate for sustenance, the local population consumed the cakes, leading to subsequent disease outbreaks. Through these experiments, researchers determined that paratyphoid was the most potent pathogen for food-based biological warfare. The ultimate goal of Unit 731 wasn't limited to battlefield applications. According to plans developed by the Japanese Imperial Army, large quantities of highly infectious germs, plague, cholera, typhoid, glanders, anthrax, and others, were to be disseminated by specially trained army units and sabotage squads throughout enemy territories. The strategy was comprehensive and terrifying in its scope. Infect soil, water sources, wells, agriculture, and livestock to inflict lethal epidemics on civilian populations. This wasn't warfare in any conventional sense. This was biological terrorism designed to cause widespread civilian suffering and death. Unit 731 had numerous branches stationed near geopolitically strategic areas like the Mongolian People's Republic and the Soviet Union, with facilities in cities like Sunyu, Hailar, Linkau, and Hailin. Each branch specialized in different aspects of biological warfare, from breeding disease vectors to developing delivery systems. The scale and organization of this program reveals that biological warfare wasn't a peripheral Japanese military interest. It was a central component of their strategic planning for prolonged conflict and territorial expansion. While Nazi medical experiments are well documented and rightfully condemned, the Japanese biological warfare program was arguably even more extensive in its scope and systematic in its approach. Where Nazi experiments often seemed driven by ideological hatred and pseudoscientific theories, Unit 731's work was coldly pragmatic, focused entirely on military effectiveness. A significant portion of our current knowledge about human survival capabilities actually originates from these horrific experiments. Nazi doctors subjected prisoners to procedures like experimental amputations, limb transplants, and exposure to extreme cold to study pilot survival in harsh conditions. Some experiments, like injecting dyes into prisoners' eyes to change their color, seemed driven by pure sadism rather than any military purpose. But Unit 731 surpassed even these atrocities in scale, if not in individual cruelty. Where Nazi experiments often targeted specific populations for ideological reasons, the Japanese program was more broadly focused on military utility, making anyone in occupied territories a potential test subject. The systematic nature of the Japanese program is revealed in numbers. While individual Nazi experiments might involve dozens of subjects, Unit 731 processed hundreds of people annually through a single facility, with estimates suggesting the total death toll could reach 250,000 across all facilities. The integration of academic institutions into the biological warfare program reveals how deeply this system penetrated Japanese society. A chilling example occurred in May and June 1945, when 14 doctors and a nurse from a local university convinced a prison commander to release 8 captured American airmen for medical experiments at the university's medical school. Over 4 separate days, these medical professionals systematically vivisected the American prisoners. On the first day, they removed lungs from 2 soldiers. The second operation involved removing victims' stomachs, hearts, and livers. The third procedure, ostensibly to study the trigeminal nerve, resulted in severe brain damage and death. The final experiment involved operations on the stomachs, gallbladders, livers, and hearts of the remaining 3 prisoners. All 8 men died during these procedures, which were conducted without adequate equipment and with no medical justification beyond curiosity and practice. In 1948, 9 physicians and medical students who participated were put on trial by a U.S. tribunal in Yokohama, with sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years imprisonment, and 2 professors receiving death sentences. This incident demonstrates that Unit 731's influence extended far beyond its own facilities, creating a culture where medical professionals throughout the Japanese military system felt authorized to treat prisoners as experimental subjects. As Japan's position in the war became untenable, efforts to conceal Unit 731's activities intensified. On August 15, 1945, with Japan's unconditional surrender, Dr. Ishii issued orders to execute the remaining 150 subjects and bury their bodies and body parts to eliminate evidence of the facility's true purpose. The destruction was systematic and thorough. As Soviet forces advanced in August 1945, branches like Unit 673 in Sunyu were ordered to destroy all facilities and evidence of bacteriological warfare production. Poison was even distributed among personnel for suicide if capture seemed imminent, revealing the lengths to which they would go to protect their secrets. Ishii himself initially attempted to fake his own death and hide from Allied forces, understanding that his crimes would likely result in execution if discovered. The systematic destruction of evidence and elimination of witnesses represented one of the most successful cover-ups in military history. In 1946, American forces located Dr. Ishii and brought him in for questioning. What happened next represents one of the most morally compromising decisions in post-war justice. Instead of facing trial for crimes against humanity, Ishii was offered a deal that would haunt the principles of international justice for decades. The United States, fearing that Ishii's biological warfare research might fall into Soviet hands, made a calculated decision to prioritize strategic advantage over justice. In exchange for complete immunity for himself and his research team from all war crimes they had committed, Ishii provided American authorities with detailed information about biological weapons development and the results of his human experimentation research. This wasn't a hasty wartime decision. This was a deliberate post-war choice to reward mass murder in exchange for scientific data. The knowledge gained from the systematic torture and killing of hundreds of thousands of people was deemed more valuable than prosecuting those responsible. The contrast with Nazi war criminals is stark. While many German doctors and researchers faced capture, trial, and execution for their crimes, the Japanese biological warfare program's leadership was not only spared but protected by the very nations they had fought against. Dr. Shiro Ishii lived freely in Japan until his natural death in 1959 at the age of 67, having enjoyed nearly 15 years of peaceful post-war life. The man responsible for one of history's most extensive programs of human experimentation died comfortably in his bed, never having faced justice for his crimes. This outcome wasn't an oversight or failure of the justice system. It was the result of a deliberate decision to prioritize Cold War strategic concerns over accountability for war crimes. The message sent was clear. Scientific knowledge, no matter how it was obtained, was more valuable than the lives of those who suffered to produce it. The families of victims never received acknowledgement, compensation, or even official recognition of what had happened to their loved ones. The survivors of biological warfare attacks in Chinese villages lived for decades with untreated injuries and infections, their suffering ignored by both Japanese and international authorities. Wang Xuan, a prominent advocate for biological warfare victims, spent decades fighting for recognition and treatment for villagers who suffered from infections that never healed, rotten legs riddled with glanders and anthrax that remained untreated until Wang Xuan's efforts, 70 years after the war, finally led to effective treatments being discovered. The secrecy surrounding Unit 731 was so effective that most people, even those directly affected by the Pacific War, remained unaware of its existence for decades. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of a coordinated effort by both Japanese and American officials to suppress information about the biological warfare program. Personal accounts reveal how this silence affected even families who lived through the war. Grandparents who witnessed Japanese atrocities in places like Hong Kong often found their stories dismissed or doubted, even by their own families. The absence of Unit 731 from educational curricula meant that generations grew up without understanding the full scope of wartime atrocities in the Pacific Theater. It wasn't until books like The Rape of Nanking began to document Japanese war crimes that public awareness started to grow. Organizations like Pacific Atrocities Education were established to uncover and disseminate knowledge about the overlooked aspects of World War II's Pacific Theater, filling gaps that official history had deliberately created. The 1984 discovery of incriminating documents in a Tokyo bookshop represents a turning point, the moment when carefully maintained secrecy began to crack. But by then, most of those responsible were already dead, having lived full lives without ever answering for their crimes. Unit 731's story raises profound questions about how we remember history and pursue justice. The decision to grant immunity to biological warfare researchers created a precedent that continues to influence international relations and justice decisions today. The pragmatic choice to prioritize strategic intelligence over accountability sent a message that crimes against humanity could be overlooked if the perpetrators possessed valuable knowledge. This calculation fundamentally undermined the principles of universal human rights and equal justice that the Allied powers claimed to represent. The biological warfare research conducted at Unit 731 advanced scientific understanding of disease transmission, human physiology under extreme conditions, and weapons development. But this knowledge came at a cost that no ethical framework can justify: the systematic torture and murder of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. The question we must confront is whether any knowledge, no matter how valuable, can justify such methods of acquisition. The Unit 731 case provides a clear answer. Some knowledge is too expensive in human terms to be worth obtaining, and certainly too tainted to be worth protecting. The failure to prosecute Unit 731's leadership had consequences that extended far beyond individual justice. It established a precedent that scientific or strategic value could override basic human rights considerations, a principle that has influenced decision-making in subsequent conflicts and controversial research programs. The protection of biological warfare researchers also contributed to the development of offensive biological weapons programs during the Cold War, as both sides sought to exploit the knowledge gained through human experimentation. Rather than serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unethical research, Unit 731's work became a foundation for further weapons development. The educational impact of this historical suppression cannot be overstated. When atrocities are hidden or minimized, societies lose the opportunity to learn from their darkest chapters. The absence of Unit 731 from historical education meant that crucial lessons about the dangers of dehumanization, unchecked scientific authority, and military expediency were never properly transmitted to subsequent generations. In discussing Unit 731, we must never lose sight of the individual human beings who suffered and died in these facilities. Each of the estimated 250,000 victims was a person with a name, a family, hopes, and dreams that were destroyed by this systematic program of horror. The Chinese civilians who were randomly abducted from Harbin streets when pregnant women or children were needed for experiments. The prisoners of war who believed they would be treated according to international conventions. The villagers who ate contaminated food distributed by Japanese soldiers, trusting that their occupiers wouldn't deliberately poison them. These weren't abstract research subjects. They were farmers, workers, soldiers, students, mothers, fathers, and children whose only crime was being in territories controlled by the Japanese military. Their suffering wasn't incidental to the research conducted at Unit 731. It was the entire point. The dehumanizing language of Maruta, logs, was designed to make it easier for researchers to ignore the humanity of their victims. But we must resist this dehumanization in our historical memory. Each person who died at Unit 731 deserves to be remembered as a human being, not as a casualty statistic in a program of scientific atrocity. Even today, more than 75 years after the end of World War II, the struggle for recognition and justice continues. Survivors of biological warfare attacks and descendants of Unit 731 victims still fight for acknowledgement, compensation, and historical accuracy. The Japanese government has been reluctant to fully acknowledge the extent of Unit 731's activities, often citing lack of documentation that was systematically destroyed at the end of the war, precisely to avoid accountability. This selective amnesia makes healing and reconciliation more difficult for affected communities. International organizations and individual advocates continue working to ensure that Unit 731's story is told accurately and completely. The goal isn't to perpetuate hatred or assign collective guilt, but to ensure that the lessons of this dark chapter are learned and remembered. The development of international laws governing medical research ethics, biological weapons prohibitions, and war crimes prosecution all draw from the recognition that programs like Unit 731 must never be allowed to occur again. But these protections are only effective if people understand why they were necessary. The story of Unit 731 isn't just historical. It remains relevant to contemporary discussions about research ethics, weapons development, and international justice. As biological research capabilities continue to advance, the ethical frameworks developed in response to wartime atrocities become increasingly important. Modern debates about gain-of-function research, dual-use biological research, and the militarization of scientific research all echo the fundamental questions raised by Unit 731. What are the ethical limits of scientific inquiry? Who decides whether research serves the greater good? How do we prevent scientific advancement from becoming a justification for human suffering? The international biological weapons conventions that exist today were developed partly in response to the recognition of what programs like Unit 731 could accomplish. But these treaties are only as strong as the commitment of nations to uphold them and the vigilance of the international community in monitoring compliance. As we conclude this examination of Unit 731, we're left with profound questions about justice, memory, and human nature. How do we process the reality that one of history's most extensive programs of human experimentation was not only unpunished, but rewarded? How do we honor the memory of victims while learning from the circumstances that made their suffering possible? The story of Unit 731 challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about how easily ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil when proper ethical safeguards are absent. It reminds us that scientific progress is not inherently moral, and that the pursuit of knowledge can become a justification for the most heinous crimes when unchecked by ethical constraints. But perhaps most importantly, Unit 731's story demonstrates the crucial importance of remembering and speaking truth about historical atrocities, even when, especially when, that truth is politically inconvenient or morally challenging. The student who discovered those documents in a Tokyo bookshop in 1984 performed an invaluable service to historical truth and human memory. Sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made in laboratories or on battlefields, but in dusty corners where inconvenient truths wait to be rediscovered. We tell this story not to condemn any particular nation or people, but to understand how societies can lose their moral bearings and how systems can be created that turn healing into harm, research into torture, and human beings into experimental subjects. These are lessons that every generation must learn anew, because the capacity for both great good and great evil lies within every human society. The victims of Unit 731 deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a program of scientific atrocity, but as human beings whose lives had meaning and value beyond their suffering. Their memory calls us to remain vigilant against the forces that made their deaths possible, and to ensure that the words, "never again," are more than just a slogan. In the end, the most fitting memorial to those who died at Unit 731 may be our commitment to creating a world where such programs are not just illegal, but literally unthinkable, where the value of human life is never subordinated to any other consideration, no matter how pressing or important it may seem. I'm your host, Jim Beaver, and this has been the World War Archive. Thank you for joining me on this difficult but necessary journey through one of history's darkest chapters. May we carry these lessons forward, not as a burden of guilt, but as a guide toward a more just and humane future. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and keep digging beyond the surface with powerful stories, expert perspectives, and exclusive content that you can't get anywhere else.